With those huge returns, all of the financial worries were quickly a distant memory. And as with the first film, Lucas was generous in sharing some of the profits with those that had helped make the film the success that it was. And because everything was in place already to tap into merchandising, Empire Strikes Back tie-ins were all over the place and bringing in unprecedented amounts of revenue. Kenner in particular was coordinating its efforts so that action figures were ready for a public that was gobbling them up. Lucasfilm was on sound financial footing, and it allowed Lucas to expand its computer division. Lucas had noted that they were approaching the 21st century by now, and yet films were still essentially based upon 19th century technology. A few improvements along the way, sure, but it was just pictures on a reel with sprocket holes. So he had several developmental projects going on with the goal of one day being able to create films without requiring literal film be involved. It was a long-range project, Lucas knew that, but one he hoped would eventually allow him to have even more creative freedom in making movies. Speaking of the future, the ending of Empire had promised that there would have to be a Star Wars 3, even if it was going to be called Episode 6. But previous films had provided lessons. The first on how to get things going, and the second on what you needed to avoid in order to not have setbacks before you even started. So this time, rather than allowing ILM to shut down and have its talented people disperse throughout the business while a building sits idle and the equipment becomes dated, Lucas instructed them to continue working on films, do effects for other pictures, and just stay in business so that when the time came, the company would be ready for the third film. So ILM quickly began doing special effects for a film called Dragon Slayer, a film which featured, in a small role, Ian McDiarmid. With that success, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan called on both ILM and the related Lucasfilm computer department, the former for the standard effects and the latter to create the Genesis Planet computer simulation. 3 more films followed before Star Wars 3 was made, all of them successes, and the goal of just stay in business was exceeded as the company became the giant of the special effects industry. But as far as the rest of Lucasfilm went, Lucas recognized what Marcia had been telling him, that the company was getting too big. Lucas decided to consolidate up in the Bay Area, bringing some people and letting others go. There were severance packages and employee counselors brought in to help the latter quickly move on to something else and minimize disruption of their lives. Again, this was a recession, so Lucas was trying to do what he could, but he recognized that the company was going to become the very thing he hated if he didn't do something about it. Charles Weber had made the company into a success, but it was just growing out of control, trying to expand into businesses that were unrelated to the core of what Lucas wanted for Lucasfilm. This could potentially be profitable, but the purpose of the company was to pursue Lucas's visions about filmmaking. Investing in ILM and the computers and having them make money, that was all fine. But making money just for the sake of making money wasn't what Lucasfilm was supposed to be about. So resources expended in that direction were a waste in his view. Weber went along with it, but after the negotiation for his new contract, which was far more lucrative than it had been, Lucas was having second thoughts and in the end decided not to keep Weber on after all. Weber and Lucas clearly were just not in step with each other on where Lucasfilm was going. There was no sense in starting this all over again up in San Francisco after all. And of course, one more person would be departing as well. Regardless of the ultimate success, Lucas was unhappy with Kurtz's job performance as producer, and Kurtz was unhappy with how Lucasfilm had become this monolithic thing that would rather spend money on BMWs than on making movies. Before Empire was even completed, the two decided to part ways, Kurtz going to work with Jim Henson on his The Dark Crystal, and Lucas tapping Howard Kazanjian, who had produced More American Graffiti and worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark. Kazanjian had overseen the final 2 weeks of filming with the strict instruction to be on time and on budget. Not an unreasonable stipulation, certainly, but this combined with the lackluster success of most of the films that he has produced, such as The Amati Girls and The Rookie, contributed to the accusation that he was just one of the many yes men that Lucas was beginning to surround himself with. But perhaps the most important departure was Irvin Kershner, although that had been seen coming. Partway through making Empire, he had been asked if he wanted to do the third film, but he had declined, unwilling to commit to another 3 years and essentially make himself a Lucasfilm employee. Plus, Kershner was getting a little frustrated at having to insist to people that this was his film. Lucas had certainly played an important part, but Kershner was the director, and he was none too happy with that credit being given to someone else. And speaking of credit, that was a point that was soon coming back to haunt Lucas, though not from Kershner himself, but from the Directors Guild of America. Kershner's card was not in the front of the film, but at the end, along with a number of other changes that deviated from DGA rules. They tried fining Lucas $250,000, but since the material was shot under British labor rules rather than Hollywood, they couldn't make that stick. Instead, they fined Kershner $25,000 for his culpability in all of this, a fine which Lucas himself paid, but this was the final straw for him and the DGA. Lucas detested people telling him what he could and couldn't do with his films, whether it was corporations or unions. He didn't care. He just wanted to make movies that looked the way he wanted them to, not what other people told him it had to be. Lucas's separation from the DGA would bring a critical change to the saga. Unlike the frustrations he had had with Empire, Raiders of the Lost Ark had been a wonderful experience for him, demanding less effort on his part and putting more in the hands of his trusted friend Steven Spielberg. Kasdan said that Lucas had recast himself from director to producer mastermind, keeping him above all of the tribulations on the set. When Kershner turned down the chance to do the third film, Spielberg was the obvious choice. The highest grossing films were going to be Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Jaws, and Raiders, 4 out of 4 being done by at least one member of this pair of friends. Combine that partnership with the Star Wars brand, it would be a critical dream and a financial godsend. And best of all, Lucas wouldn't be as troubled as he was on Empire. He could sit back like on Raiders and leave the majority of things in the hands of Spielberg. And with ILM running like a well-oiled machine, there would be no reason for him to worry about the film at all. That would, of course, mean that Lucas could fulfill his promise to Marcia to pull back and allow them to enjoy the fruits of success, rather than fixating on empire building. Star Wars would have Lucas to guide and shape it, but without him needing to be chained to it. That would allow then for Episode 6 to hit theaters in 1983, and then Episode 1 in 1986, and so on to create all 9 films. This trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy that involved Luke's sister, bringing the franchise into the 21st century. The money was there, the talent was there, the infrastructure was in place, and Lucas was flush with ideas and vigor. The DGA decision changed everything. Now Lucas would be unable to hire Spielberg to direct because he was a member of the Guild. Without Spielberg, a director he could trust implicitly with his baby, he would need to find someone else to fill the role. And the same thing that ruled out Spielberg ruled out all of the other directors that Lucas personally knew. And he had already decided that he was not going to handle the directing himself. So he would have to pick either an international director, an up-and-coming artist who was interested in directing but hadn't yet, or an American director outside of the Guild. Terry Gilliam, for instance, wasn't in the DGA, so he was a possibility. There were a lot of people interested, but the person that Lucas chose was Richard Marquand of the UK, a sharp difference from both Kershner and Spielberg. Both those men were friends with Lucas personally, but also committed to their own visions. They would be accommodating, but they expected Lucas to allow them the freedom to make their movies their way. But Marquand was experienced primarily in television, documentaries, and short films. By this time, he had made only one feature-length film, the critically mixed horror film The Legacy, which had done modestly at the box office. He was wrapping up his second, Eye of the Needle, which he showed to Lucas and helped convince him to give it to Marquand. But given his rather unimpressive overall resume, he seemed an odd choice. But this was actually part of the appeal. What Lucas wanted was someone who would make the third movie his way, not their own way, and someone with Marquand's background would thus work to avoid going over budget and bend his vision to accommodate that of the executive producer, Lucas himself. Basically, Lucas wanted to have his directorial vision without the tediousness of having to be on set directing, and Marquand was his man. The reason for this, in part, was probably because Lucas's marriage was starting to get shaky from his work on Lucasfilm. Marcia was supportive of George in all of his work, and many agreed she was an invaluable asset for him, both creatively and as a partner. She was involved with the company and with the ranch, but she felt that they were spending too much time on that they had paid their dues, worked 25 hours a day, 8 days a week to build all of this. Why not slow down at least a little, stop and smell the roses, and most importantly, get down to starting the family that they had wanted? The two soon adopted a baby girl, Amanda, and Lucas planned to be there for her, even one day insisting that Kenner, which was bringing in money hand over fist with the action figures, create a plush Ewok toy so that he could have some Star Wars merchandise to give to his daughter. Lucas really wanted to stop the workaholic lifestyle he'd adopted since the mid-70s, to be there for Amanda, and to patch up his relationship with Marcia. He even briefly toyed with the idea of just selling Star Wars outright, turn over all his notes and everything, and just leave it all in someone else's hands. But he couldn't, because he had a very complicated relationship with Star Wars. It had made him a true success, opened doors to possibilities he had never considered, ensured that whatever direction he wanted to take his film career, he could now. He could even strong-arm a toy company halfway across the country to make something it didn't want to make, just so he could make his daughter happy. Yeah, sure, we're just a toy company. What the hell do we know about selling toys? Star Wars was a dream for him that would exceed any reasonable expectation that a film student could have. It was a rare blend of material otherwise dismissed as schlock into a product that audiences and critics adored. But he was now trapped by his creation, in love with it, and yet resentful of it. Lucas had started becoming defensive. What he originally freely admitted was dragging film serials and pulp stories into the modern era was now being recast as the result of an intellectual examination of the human collective unconsciousness. While Lucas certainly was a well-read individual, aware of a variety of anthropological and mythological theories and examinations, the making of Star Wars was hardly a calculated intellectual exercise, as was being more and more implied, and the tale of its creation would undergo further embellishment. Lucas would eventually claim that his script was so big he chopped it into thirds and essentially the whole trilogy laid out early on, which simply wasn't true. Eventually he would go on to say that Star Wars was originally twice that size and called The Tragedy of Darth Vader, which contradicted all records of the creation of the original Star Wars. But as more than one observer has noted, Lucas seemed to be struggling with a sense of insecurity about his work, and as a very intelligent person gradually looked at the intellectual aspects of his series and was effectively believing that it was a subconscious basis for Star Wars success, those complex ideas that he had studied and digested, and repeating that often enough that the subconscious influence became meticulously laid plans. This is not to say that Lucas is a liar, just that in the course of time, how he would like to remember things can often overwrite what our actual memories of that experience are. And it's certainly understandable why. While Spielberg was always impressed with Star Wars, the rest of Lucas's friends, while admiring what he had achieved, were interested in more serious works. They were all making Citizen Kane's while he was making Flash Gordon. Coppola would repeatedly say that Star Wars had robbed cinema of one of its most innovative creators, putting Lucas on a path from the great films that he could have made and instead settling just for making space opera. So it's no wonder that Lucas would seek some justification that his saga possessed intellectual and artistic merits, that it was more than just escapist fun or a means for him to create a business empire. And Skywalker Ranch would be all the more important in proving this, a place that would revolutionize independent filmmaking. What more do you need to do to show a commitment to the intellectual and artistic aspect of cinema than that? Work on it was already underway, so Lucas committed himself to writing the final chapter of this trilogy.